took land that was marginal at best, or probably they were never going to harvest for forest. And they said, okay, this will be our wilderness. But it's also really, really beautiful areas, really areas that were pristine, that nobody had ever lived. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Desolation Wilderness. Anybody? Yes. If you're going to be in Berkeley for 4 years, it's 3 hours away. It's one of the easiest ones to get to. I went last summer on a backpacking trip. It's super stunning. So if you go to Tahoe, this is Highway 50, and here's South Lake here. You go right by it, and you can go into a couple different roads on the backside. It's amazing sets of lakes super high up. Put it on your list. Don't miss it. Get somebody to take you there. So there's a whole lot of different wilderness areas along the ridge here. But this is probably one of the easiest ones for you to get to for a weekend. Beautiful. So federal legislation. So we've talked about this before. We talked about where did environmental impact statements come from. That was the National Economic Environmental Policy Act. That was the act that required the federal government to do environmental impact statement on future actions. So originally they were like, let's just look at the environmental impact statement of new management. But now this is how things are litigated. This is how it is in the process for environmental impact statements where litigation over management and how many roads to build and what culverts to build and all sorts of how to manage land happens. The Endangered Species Act, we've already talked about a bunch, 1973. So the federal government needs to plan on the habitat effects on certain species that are listed on a special list. So this has really come into effect our national forest lands a lot. And then within the Forest Service, there's something called the Resources Planning Act. So that's looking like, let's do longer-term planning. Previously the Forest Service was like, okay, where's the road going to go next year? Where did the road go last year? Let's continue it on. Let's get more lumber coming to our mills. And this is a lot more, now we have tools like GIS. We have long-term planning. We have ways to measure the biomass of a whole forest and think about how much biomass we're taking out at any given time. We have targets for how much to take over any given year, but we have targets for how much we'll leave and we'll still be able to be there in future decades. So this is, turning the Forest Service from just, churn out future source of biomass to sort of like on a long-term path. The other thing we talked about in Clean Water Act is how this came into many different effects because there's a lot of different kinds of water pollution. The way, this isn't sewage treatment plants. There's not people living in the national forest to that scale. But what has happened for national forests is building roads with bulldozers, extensive roads. There's millions and millions of miles of dirt roads in the national forests. And those let runoff flow into these creeks that we use for habitat. It's just, a runoff of basically like dirt. And there's what's called the total maximum daily load. So now we have restrictions on how much dirt can end up in a creek from somebody managing the creek for wildlife. That gets pushed upstream to how many roads, how are the culverts built, what sort of runoff there is, how much runoff happens. So we have, legislation from the Clean Water Act that's taken 20 years to get into the management of roadless areas and management of, how many roads they can build on a precious, pristine salmon stream. And here we have, there's a baby owl. Did you guys want to say ah? Okay, you're supposed to say that when there's a baby animal. So the spotted owl was on the list of endangered species. They only put their nests in the top of old growth trees. So they need big chunks of pristine forest that's never been cut. They're not going to put their nest in a clear cut. They're going to go extinct if we just have managed forest. So we have to keep some pristine forests for them. Huge debate, a huge controversy in how we manage our western lands. Sort of like the pinnacle of the divide between like the loggers and the environmentalists. No one ever sees this bird. It's like very reclusive and remote and only lives in, it's like just a figment of this listing that it's something that's part of our popular knowledge. So here's a map of where spotted owls have lived. And then you can see in the green here, this is the Forest Service area, so they're the single biggest chunk. And then this here, basically, is private forest, right? So most of the spotted owls are up here. This is, I think, a lot of this is private forest, too. Yeah, so a lot of this is all private forest and some rangeland. So a huge amount of management that's happening on public lands. And these public lands up here are feeding mills, that are part of the rural economy. So how we manage the spotted owl and how we allow roads, how we allow the chainsaws out there has almost, completely changed the rate at which lumber is cut. A timeline on the spotted owl. So there was a draft environmental impact statement in 1986 that said, let's reduce the harvest by 5%. This is the Forest Service are triangulating. They see this thing coming. They see this habitat listing coming. They're like, oh, how can we shift a little bit? But in 1989, there was a big court order to protect litigation on behalf of the spotted owl, saying the Forest Service had to stop planned sales. And then in 1990, the owl was listed, put on the official list. And in 1991, its habitat was listed, and that's 12 million acres are critical habitat. So a huge amount of area of the western U.S. is part of the critical habitat. That's going to fall. Any cuts they do, any roads they build are going to fall under how are they managing this habitat. There's been other endangered species that are really affecting the western U.S. and certainly California since then. The marbled murrelet is a very particular sort of kind of duck that only builds its nest again in old growth trees up high, very rare, and they need a similar amount of pristine habitat. And then in California, there's a bunch of endangered salmon runs that happen to be on creeks that flow right out of national forests. And the science improves. People like you guys graduate from UC Berkeley, go and work at Humboldt, do the science, prove the amount of silt in the river, prove that we know that forestry is affecting the salmon runs, but now we have more and more science coming out to show us how the juvenile salmon are not able to make it out because of temperature, or the mature salmon are not able to lay eggs because the bed of the river is different. So the current policy regime is called adaptive management. A lot less timber is coming out, and I showed you how much the number of board feet has dropped off. There is some issue of ecosystem management, so managing it as an ecosystem, not just as somewhere producing board feet. We have GIS and putting maps of resources sort of at a kernel of happening at the Forest Service. Like people are mapping the whole forest and deciding, where's vulnerable, let's map that. Deciding where is low cost to get in, let's map that. There was also a whole period where nothing was getting cut through, things had been stopped because of the spotted owl, and there were millions of board feet that were taken out under salvage logging, where things had been damaged, there had been a fire, there had been a beetle infestation. They were like, oh, let's go do salvage logging, but it was a sort of a way to keep the mills open and operating. And then, there's this issue of there's multiple stakeholders. There's people who need jobs, and there's people who are litigating for the environment, and is there some way that we can get those discussion going between the environmental groups and the locals? Can we put some sort of bargains into our management plan? Let's manage this so that, we get some environmental protection, but we have some way to keep, jobs in the local area, and we have some way to keep mills open. So I'm going to dabble a little bit in the forestry economics, a resources stock model. It's in a side box in the chapter 17 So most of chapter 17 is about fisheries, which I will do next time, but there's a side box in chapter 17 that you can look through some of this. But I just want to motivate it. Again, resources are a dynamic model. They have time in them, right? So when to cut the forest and replant the forest and grow it again. That's the basic starting point for a forestry model. We would say, in our starting point for our super abstract Econ 1 forestry model, we say there's no, there's clearly defined land. There's no opportunity cost to land. We have land that would just be for a forest. It doesn't have other uses. We're going to abstract those away and say, let's just try and figure out when is the optimal rotation of growing trees. Not how many trees to cut, but how often are we going to go in and cut them. We're going to regrow forests, cut them, grow them, cut them. That's what our economic model is on this question of when to cut them. What's the length of a rotation? So we have a growth function. It's a dynamic model, so it's going to be time down here. And we're going to have some rate. So this will be a biomass, a quantity of board feet we can get out at any time t. So we'll have t0 here. You could think of this as time 0, or you could think of this as year 10 or something. You plant the forest the first time that something is harvestable. If we wanted it to be actual time 0, we would start the graph here because the first 10 years there's nothing to harvest. But so let's just say there's the point at which there's something to harvest, and then we have some sort of biomass function like this. We have different periods of biomass growth. So at first we have slower growth. The forest is small; it's just getting going. If we cut down here, we haven't really got the big amount of growth yet. And then we have another chunk in here that the forest is growing really fast. The forest is increasing. We're on a really steep part of the growth function here. We're getting more each year. The forest is getting bigger and bigger. And then, but if we let it go too long, the amount of growth tapers off. We have a mature forest. It's not really clear whether this goes down or goes flat, but at some point there's only so many board feet out there, the forest reaches an equilibrium, and it's not growing very much more. It's when the trees are bigger than this, smaller than this, they're growing really fast. They're adding up, they're shooting up, and they're adding a whole bunch of board feet every year. So we think about that in their background, there's some sort of growth function that we can map. We can go out there and measure it. We can have people from UC Berkeley and Mulford Hall, they'll give us this model, and they'll show us how to go out and measure it for different types of forest. So one other to think, at the top of this graph, the highest that we get to, that's the maximum. So this is the maximum amount of forest growth that we have. After this point, it's not growing anymore, it's going down a little bit. So there's going to be some maximum amount and some time at which we would be at the maximum yield. So our question is, how do we do a maximum sustainable yield over years? So we want to have the highest average growth. One way to think about this over all of our harvests. So over all of the possible years, what's the highest average growth? And one first way to model this or think about it is where the growth rate, the rate at which it's increasing, is going to equal to the average growth. Okay, so if we set the average growth equal to the marginal growth, we'll have one point that we can use as a starting point for maximum sustainable yield. So average growth, in a lot of these cases, you can do as array from the origin. Because if this, the yield, and this is time, then we're going to have our yield divided by our time at any point along this line. So if we have array from the origin, it will give us average yield. I think in forestry we'll get to its mean annual increment. So we put them together. We have our growth function. We had our maximum here. This is the max. We have, we have different ways this could go. So here there's 2 points that the average will equal to the, be equal to the growth rate. And the highest will be at the point where there's an array that's tangent. So the slope here being the marginal, the slope of this curve will be equal to this average rate. So this is our first ideal time. And this is trying to solve this problem of when to cut down the forest. So this is the highest point that we got in terms of average yields. It's also the point that the marginal equal the average. If I can draw a little graph in here, we would have a marginal function, and it's going to cross some average function. These would be the slopes of these lines. And the point where they cross, it's the point where these are tangent, and that, by definition, is going to be the maximum of this average, the mean annual increment curve. There's a lot of sort of calculus and growth curves embedded into it. I'm not going to get too into the calculus, but I'm just going to sort of motivate by thinking we want to make a cut at where we're having the highest average growth, and then replant and grow to that point again. Maximum sustainable yield in this one period is going to be when the average growth is equal to the marginal growth, and that's going to give us an amount that we're going to get when we cut and a time that we should cut, a time that we should harvest. We call it maximizing the mean annual increment. Sometimes you see this in forest economics. I think that the marginal is called the current annual increment. So we want to maximize the total quantity of wood that we get. Now we want to think that we're doing it over multiple time horizons, multiple time periods. So we're going to cut, and then we're going to cut, and then we're going to cut. So if we did multiple time periods, we've figured out this optimal time when we want to cut. We want to replant, and this is the first time period first. We're going to regrow our forest. This would be 2 times this t star, and it would go on. This is us managing our forest rotation so that we're getting the maximum average yield. We're getting, over time, the maximum board feet that we can out of this plot of land. So, this is like 75 years, 90 years, something like that. If you ever go to Oregon, this place where I've seen it in California too, but they do the clear cuts there, and you can sort of see the clear cuts, and they'll put little placards up like this was planted in 1975, this was planted in 1985, this was planted in 1995, and you can see the different age stands and how much they're growing. That's private lands that you see those signs on usually. So this is the biology. This is just a growth function in time. This is just if we had biology to deal with. And if it was an economic model, we would change things. We would need to do net present value. So we would need to do the future streams, when the harvest is going to be, and that money net present value back to this period, the current time period. And then all future harvests, we need to bring those back to the current period. So we would have to have interest rates embedded in the model. In most of these cases in the beginning, we're just going to say, there's some sort of simple constant costs, but costs could change with different management. That's sort of where we're at right now with adaptive management. And then prices could change in the future. Is there a price path for this renewable natural resources? That's going to be different in the future than it is now. But you sort of imagine we're going to start with present values and interest rates. So I'm just going to talk through this without getting into calculus. But so now we have our growth rate, and that should be relating and interacting with the interest rate. So we're going to harvest earlier than we did in the previous model. In the previous model, we wanted to get to the maximum of mean annual increment. So now our harvest, we're going to be pulling things back in terms of our net present value. We want money now, so money in the distant future will be worth less, so we're going to harvest sooner than the one that we just solved. So there's going to be a marginal benefit of allowing an additional year of growth, but there's going to be a marginal cost of waiting an additional year. So we have other things to do with our money. We have impatience to have it now, so now there's going to be some marginal cost, a term with interest rate in it. Intuitively, we want to think about it. If our growth rate is higher than our interest rate, the biomass is growing faster than some other investment we could make, so we can harvest later. If the growth rate is less than the interest rate, we could be doing better on this other investment. We had some opportunity cost of capital. You can think about it as we'd rather harvest. So, and then when we think about in terms of multiple harvests, we have to do a net present value of the stream of other multiple harvests. So now we have this marginal benefit of allowing things to grow versus the marginal cost of waiting longer to get our profit. And then we also have the marginal cost of delaying all the future payments that come from future rotations. So now we have, for all future rotations, we have an even shorter time that we're going to harvest compared to just the net present value in a single period model, a single rotation model, and then what we started with by solving for mean annual increment. So when we bring interest rates in, it makes us want to bring things sooner. We want money sooner, we harvest sooner, we want to get harvest 2 and harvest 3, all of those sooner. So this is a rotation formula. It's in the book, the Faustman formula. Part of what the Faustman formula says is there's a value, an expected value for the piece of land that's going to take into account the sum of all of the future harvests. Here, I'm going to redo this formula. You don't actually have to know this, but we just want to be able to think about how discounting affects our management. This is just the same formula, but I'm going to redo it in 1 plus r to the t minus 1. So we're discounting our future harvests, and we have a sum of the values of all the future harvests, and we're going to be able to sum that up into the value of this land as a sum of an infinite series. So there's a table in the book that you can think about when we went into cost curves, and sometimes it was easier when we did, like on the homework, we had a spreadsheet to think about cost curves. So the operative thing to think about here is this is when to cut the forest in 5 years, 5-year increments, right? So this is how long should we let the trees grow till we cut them. And so here's this growth function. This part here would be this yield and time. So it would be this one's here and yields up here. So this is the chart that we've already seen. But now we have this discount factor, the 1 plus r to the t, and the t is now coming into effect because we have the age of the rotations. And we have the value of the first time that we cut it, and then we have the value of all of the rest of the times that we're going to cut it into the future, the present value of every additional harvest. So this chart is just helping to think about what are these different parts to it. This is like, the harvest in one period, the first time, and this is the discounted present value of all of the future harvests. And so the maximum, for the first harvest is somewhere around here, and the maximum for all future harvests is here. So this is, where we would maximize. So the optimal is at a 75-year rotation. Important is this table has some r in it. This isn't varying r. This is keeping some interest rate constant and varying when we're going to harvest the wood into the future. And then there's a chart that's with different interest rates. And how this is that chart was done with a 2% interest rate. But you could change the interest rate and you would get different curves and different rotations. So if the interest rate was 2%, you would harvest every 75 years and regrow. If the interest rate was 7%, you would harvest every 55 years. You want to get more money now and keep regrowing and having a much shorter forest when you grow it because it's more important to get money sooner. So we can also think about other parts of the model. What happens if the price of timber goes up? The more price of timber goes up, you're going to shorten your rotation length. Each harvest will be more profitable. We can move our profits earlier. And then from there we can think, is the price of wood on a curve where it's going up over time? Here we just change the interest rate. So if you increase the interest rate, you're going to shorten your rotation, move more profits towards the present. Then we can think about, are we going to change harvest costs? What if the Forest Service says you can't build roads like that? You have to do some more intensive way to protect wildlife. Basically, we're going to say, we're just going to, in the basic model, we're saying the price is going to be net of some sort of constant cost. But if we do some adaptive management, increase the burden on people taking the stuff out of the forest, we're going to basically decrease the net price that they're going to get. And that will lead to an increase in rotation length. Each harvest individually becomes less profitable, so we're going to leave longer rotations. We're going to delay some of the costs out into the future. So from there, you can make a whole bunch of more complicated forest models. Is harvesting a function of volume? Is the price of wood going to be going up? Is the price of wood the function? Is the quality of the wood a function of how big the